You want me to get into the second issue of why the Chinese are going to vanish? And when I say vanish, that's the word. They are literally vanishing as a people. Everyone's familiar with the one-child policy. It worked very well. If anything, it worked too well. And after having it in place for 35 years, we have a population bomb. And as of January of this year, according to official Chinese state statistics, China was the fastest aging society in human history with the largest sex imbalance in human history. They had aged past the point that they could even theoretically maintain their population at its current size into the future. They had run out of people of childbearing age. By 2100, there will be half as many Chinese as there are today. And then in April, they started to release details from their 10-year census. And they realized that they had been overcounting their population for some time. And that 2100 date for half as many people was moved forward to 2070. As of last month, early October, some of this data has been broken down by some Chinese academics and demographers, and they're like, we need more data, but we fear that that half date is now moved up to 2050. And for that to be true, the Chinese would have overcounted their population by 100 million. And all of that 100 million would be people who would be theoretically born since one child, so age 35 and under. In which case, China peaked in terms of its population, not 2 years ago, like they were originally thinking, 15 years ago. And we've already seen a 12-fold increase in Chinese labor costs since 1999. So it tracks with the economic data. So China is not getting rich, it's getting old. They are no longer the low-cost producer, and they haven't advanced enough to become a high-quality producer. So from a purely economic point of view, even if the US keeps holding up the ceiling, China is facing utter demographic collapse in less than a decade. What's going on in China right now is Chairman Xi has instituted a cult of personality, and he's imprisoned, killed, exiled, or intimidated and silenced everyone in the country who's capable of independent thought. And he probably has the best understanding of just how bad the demographic situation is. And so he knows, for reasons demographic, financial, geopolitical, trade, he knows that the country's current economic model has failed. And he knows he can't guarantee economic growth, and he knows he can't keep the lights on, and he knows he can't win a war with the Americans. How do you maintain CCP supremacy if the things that you have guaranteed for 50 years no longer can be guaranteed? And the answer is naked, blatant ultranationalism, ethnocentric ultranationalism of the Nazi style. And so Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, warrior wolf diplomacy, these are all aspects of the same policy. Convince the average Chinese that it's no longer about the economics. Convince them that being a pan ultranationalist is enough. And that is where the CCP gets its authority now. So they don't care at the top about supply chains or economic performance or even employment. Hell, they don't care about keeping the electricity on. A third of the country is facing power rationing. They're already warning people to stockpile food. These are not the sorts of things you do if you think you're going to achieve economic breakout or even economic continuity. These are the sorts of things that you do if you know that the bottom's falling out and there's nothing you can do about it. And you have to shift the conversation to remain in power. I mean, we can have a conversation about authoritarian systems and what allows them to persist. I'm saying that they're facing something far more dramatic. They know economic structures that they have relied upon since Deng are collapsed, and they know that they can't repair them. So they have to have a fundamentally different sort of China for the CCP to have a chance of maintaining control. The question is, of course, whether or not that will work. And I think it's far too early in the process to have a prognosis for that. Well, the Chinese system is not based on money as an economic good like it is here in the United States. In China, money is a political good. So it exists to serve the needs of the CCP. So they expand their money supply in extreme volumes in order to make sure that there's enough credit in the system so that any employer can employ any number of people. The goal is not efficiency. The goal is not even economic expansion. The goal is employment. because if people have jobs, they don't get together in large groups and go on long walks together. That's how the current Politburo got their jobs. They are not going to give them up. Because of that, you can make the argument that all of the economic growth that we have seen in China since 2006 is because of debt. They've expanded corporate debt to something, I believe, like 350% of GDP now. I don't have those numbers right in front of me, but I think that's the number, making China the most indebted country in human history in both absolute and relative terms. So imagine if Enron ran every sector of the American economy. That's the scale of what we're looking here. And any country that's come within an order of magnitude of this, well, I'm sorry, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Any country that has come within half of this has ultimately collapsed under the debt load. So the question in my mind is not will it, but when will it? And that's one of the things that is driving this policy of ethno-nationalism that Xi is doing, because he realizes that this system has run out of juice. As they issued more and more debt in the last 15 years, it's generated progressively less economic activity.
So do you think that there's a real threat to Taiwan?
If you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have said no. The reason is that if the Chinese were to take over Taiwan tomorrow, they couldn't operate the semiconductor industry. If they were capable of operating it, they would have built their own. The Chinese are not very high value added. They can only make the really low end computer chips, and they can only do that with equipment that was built elsewhere, installed by foreigners, and maintained by foreigners. So the idea that they could just walk into TSMC headquarters and just take over and make it run is silly. Besides, all the designs for those chips come from the United States. And if they did this, they're moving towards an economic collapse and a deindustrialization scenario anyway. And if that is now the guiding thought of Xi Jinping, then all of a sudden, economic fallout from a conflict is something they're going to experience whether they do the war or not. So there is something to be said for choosing the time and the place of the conflict and being the one who pulls the trigger, and so being the one who can write the narrative about why the conflict is happening. So I would say that the risk to Taiwan today is higher than it's ever been. It doesn't mean that I think a war is imminent or even inevitable, but I'd give it a 1 in 3 chance now, which is the highest I've ever considered it. It is now part of the national mythos as created by Xi Jinping. And it's a very, very effective way of beating the drum from time to time. So I can't imagine Beijing going for any sort of compromise. Honestly, the strategic ambiguity as it existed a year ago served both sides, because it allowed the Chinese to do their little chest beating every once in a while, allowed Taiwan to have its de facto independence, and the United States didn't have to do anything. Things are changing, though. The calculus is shifting in Washington. The Biden administration, in bits and pieces, is redefining strategic ambiguity, and it is not clear to me what the end game is here. This is a very in-play issue. Biden on multiple occasions has said things that are far beyond the pale for what has passed for strategic ambiguity in recent decades, talking about having a direct defense agreement with the Taiwanese, which doesn't exist, saying that an attack on Taiwan's attack on the United States, which doesn't exist in law, and basically starting to treat Taiwan by all the matters that matter as a real independent country, which of course it is. So it's kind of hard to argue on this from a logical point of view. But it does seem that the Biden administration is not so much edging towards, but striding boldly towards formal recognition. Biden says it in interviews, not as an off-the-cuff comment. He's been very direct. He's done it multiple times. Remember, I don't have access to his morning briefing. It's entirely possible that the president's inner circle has come to the conclusion that everything that China says about Taiwan is a bluff. That's reasonable. And if that is the case, you want to talk about a massive foreign policy win. That'd be it. I'm a big believer in the long-term durability of American power. So I personally don't see the point in picking at the Taiwan issue or picking at the Crimea issue, because I'm pretty convinced that countries like China and Russia aren't going to last a whole lot longer, and we can just wait them out. Like I said, people who believe my way have lost 9 times in a row. Well, the Taiwanese position internally is pretty clear. This is not the first secessionist president we've had in Taiwan. It's the third. It's like, this is the majority opinion here. But dual deterrence was very successful. I'm just saying that the mindset on both sides of the Pacific is changing. For the Chinese, this has now become not an existential threat issue, but an opportunity to maintain CCP power And on the American side of the equation, if we don't care about global stability anymore,